When I first moved into Willow Creek, I thought I had finally found my dream neighborhood. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, the homes had that picture-perfect suburban look, and the HOA brochure promised a tight-knit, friendly community. At the time, I actually believed it. I thought this was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, where kids played safely on the sidewalks, and where the HOA worked for the good of everyone. It didn't take long for me to realize how wrong I was. Within weeks of moving in, the letters started arriving. At first, they were small things, reminders they called them. A notice about my garbage cans being visible for too long on collection day, a complaint about my grass being half an inch taller than the community guidelines, even a warning about the color of my mailbox flag, which apparently didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. At first, I thought it was just standard HOA stuff. Annoying, sure, but maybe they were just strict. I tried to comply. I brought my trash cans in earlier, trimmed my grass more often, even repainted my mailbox to a shade of beige that matched the approved palette. But no matter how much I complied, the notices didn't stop. Then they escalated. The fines started rolling in. $100 here, $200 there. A supposed violation for a non-standard welcome mat, another for overly decorative garden lights. The board seemed to scrutinize every detail of my property, almost like they were waiting for me to slip up. I later found out that most of my neighbors had never even received so much as a warning. It became obvious that I had been singled out. The ringleader behind it all was the HOA president, a woman named Carol. If you looked up the word power trip in the dictionary, her face would have been right there next to it. She strutted through the neighborhood like she owned every square inch of it, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on the slightest deviation from her rules. To her, the HOA wasn't about maintaining property values or building community. It was about control. I'll never forget one afternoon when I caught her standing in front of my house, arms crossed, glaring at the wreath on my front door. She didn't say a word. She just scribbled something down on her clipboard, smirked, and walked away. 2 days later, I received a violation notice for non-approved holiday decorations. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about enforcing rules, this was personal. The harassment only intensified over the next year. Every project I tried to do, whether it was planting flowers, installing a new mailbox, or repainting my shutters, was denied by the board. Meanwhile, other neighbors were given approval for far more extravagant renovations. When I asked why, the responses were vague, full of bureaucratic jargon about community standards and aesthetic consistency. The truth was clear. The board, under Carol's iron grip, wanted me out. The breaking point came one summer afternoon. I received a certified letter in the mail informing me that, due to chronic non-compliance and multiple unresolved violations, the HOA board had voted to begin proceedings to foreclose on my home. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the letter, my hands shaking. They were actually trying to take my house away over things as ridiculous as a wreath, a welcome mat, and some garden lights. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But beneath the shock, a different emotion began to take root: anger. Up until then, I had played by their rules. I had tried to comply, tried to stay under the radar, tried to avoid conflict. But they didn't want compliance. They wanted submission. They wanted me gone, simply because I refused to bow down to their petty power games. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to roll over. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The first step was research. I spent hours poring over the HOA bylaws, the community covenants, and the state laws governing homeowners associations. What I found was shocking. The board had been operating far outside the scope of their authority. They had been fining homeowners for things that weren't even violations. They had been denying projects without proper justification, and in some cases, they had even been misusing HOA funds for administrative expenses that conveniently aligned with Carol's personal interests. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became, but also the more determined. I started talking to my neighbors. At first, some were hesitant, afraid of rocking the boat. But as I shared what I'd found, the stories started pouring out. Others had been targeted too, though not as relentlessly as me. One family had been fined for excessive Halloween decorations. Another had their application for a simple backyard shed denied, even though 3 other homes had sheds approved. Slowly, I realized I wasn't alone. The resentment toward the board was widespread, simmering just beneath the surface. People were frustrated, but they didn't know what to do. They felt powerless against Carol and her clique of loyal board members. That's when the idea first hit me. If the board could vote to kick me out, then surely the community could vote to kick them out. It wouldn't be easy. Carol had been president for years, and she ruled the HOA like a queen on her throne. But according to the bylaws, homeowners had the right to call for a recall election if they gathered enough signatures. It was a long shot, but it was possible. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I had to do. The fight was no longer just about me or my house. It was about standing up to a system of petty tyranny that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Carol and her cronies had built their power on fear and intimidation. But fear only works as long as people stay silent. I wasn't going to be silent anymore. As I looked around my neighborhood, at the homes that people had worked their entire lives to afford, I realized something important. This wasn't just their community, it was mine too. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. The battle lines had been drawn, and the first strike was about to come from me. The moment I decided to fight back, everything in my perspective shifted. No longer did I see myself as a helpless victim of the HOA's harassment. I saw myself as someone who had been pushed too far, someone who was about to turn the tables on those who thought they held all the power. But if I was going to take down Carol and her board, I couldn't do it alone. I needed the support of the very community they had been mistreating for years. The first step was gathering proof. I spent weeks compiling every notice, every fine, and every rejection letter I had ever received. I organized them into folders, highlighting the absurdity of the claims. I cross-referenced them with the HOA's official guidelines, and time after time, the violations didn't match up. My so-called infractions weren't violations at all. They were fabrications, written up to pressure me into submission. I didn't stop there. I also started looking into the HOA's financial records, which, by law, had to be made available to any homeowner upon request. When I finally got my hands on them, what I found was enough to make my blood boil. Thousands of dollars had been spent on vague administrative costs. Large checks had been written out to companies with no real online presence, companies that, after some digging, turned out to be connected to Carol's family. There were reimbursements for board-related travel and community event supplies, but no such events had ever taken place. This was bigger than me. This was corruption. Armed with my evidence, I began reaching out to neighbors one by one. I didn't start with the loudest complainers or the angriest residents. I started with the ones I knew were quietly frustrated but too afraid to speak up. The ones who grumbled about the board under their breath but never dared confront them directly. I invited them over, showed them my stack of violations, then the financial records. I explained the process for a recall election, and slowly but surely, the mood shifted. People who had once shrugged and said, "That's just how the HOA is," began to realize that they weren't powerless after all. One neighbor, a retired veteran named Frank, admitted he had been fined 3 times for his American flag being too large. Another, a young mother named Sarah, revealed she had been denied permission to build a small playhouse for her kids, even though Carol's own grandchildren had a massive jungle gym in their backyard. The hypocrisy was staggering, and once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Momentum began to build. I printed flyers summarizing the board's abuses, leaving them in mailboxes late at night. I set up a private Facebook group for residents where people could share their stories without fear of Carol's retaliation. Within weeks, dozens of families had joined, and the floodgates opened. Tales of harassment, bullying, and favoritism poured in. It became clear that Carol had been ruling through fear and manipulation for years. Still, there was a lingering hesitation. People were angry, but they were also scared. What if Carol retaliated? What if the board raised their dues or targeted them with bogus fines the way they had done to me? That's when I realized I had to be the one to take the first real risk. I filed an official petition for a recall election, citing the bylaws that gave homeowners the right to remove board members with a majority vote. The petition required signatures from at least 25% of the homeowners, which meant I needed to go door to door. I knew that every knock on a door was another opportunity, but also another chance for Carol's loyalists to slam the door in my face. And believe me, some did. There were neighbors who looked me dead in the eye and said, "I don't want to get involved," before shutting the door. Others whispered that they agreed with me but didn't dare sign, afraid of the board's wrath. And then there were the outright loyalists, those who had been benefiting from Carol's favoritism, who accused me of stirring up trouble and told me I should just sell my house and leave. But for every rejection, there were 2 or 3 who eagerly signed. Some did it quietly, looking over their shoulder before putting pen to paper. Others signed with a sense of relief, like they had been waiting years for someone to finally stand up. It wasn't easy, but day by day, signature by signature, the petition grew. When I finally hit the threshold, I submitted the petition to the board, with copies to the county's HOA oversight office, making sure it couldn't be lost or misplaced the way so many other complaints had been. Carol's reaction was immediate and explosive. Within a week, I received yet another violation notice, this time claiming that the paint on my shutters was fading and needed to be replaced. Neighbors who had signed the petition also began receiving sudden inspections and bizarre fines. Carol was striking back, trying to intimidate us into backing down. But it was too late. The dam had already broken. Instead of backing down, more neighbors rallied. Every time Carol targeted someone, it only added fuel to the fire. People who had once been neutral started choosing sides, and they weren't choosing hers. The recall election was scheduled for 3 months later. In the meantime, the community became a battleground. Carol held emergency board meetings, sending out glossy newsletters claiming that malicious rumors were being spread by disgruntled homeowners. She painted me as a troublemaker who wanted to destroy the community. But the more she fought, the more desperate she looked. And the more desperate she looked, the more support I gained. By the time Election Day rolled around, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. For the first time in years, people felt like they actually had a say in how their community was run. The turnout was massive, far higher than any HOA election in the past. I'll never forget the look on Carol's face as the votes were counted. One by one, the numbers stacked against her. Not just against her, but against the entire board. Every member loyal to her was voted out, replaced by homeowners who had had enough. When the final tally was announced, it was official. Carol was no longer president. Her reign of petty tyranny was over. But then came the twist that no one saw coming. When the dust settled and the new board members gathered to elect a new president, all eyes turned to me. I hadn't campaigned for it. I hadn't even asked for it. But in the eyes of the community, I was the one who had led the charge, the one who had taken the risk, the one who had fought back when no one else dared. And with a unanimous vote, I was elected the new president of the Willow Creek HOA. The same board that had once tried to kick me out of my home had just made me their leader. But as the weight of that reality sank in, I realized something important. Taking down Carol was only the beginning. Running the HOA would be a whole different battle, and that battle was just about to begin. Becoming HOA president felt surreal. For so long, I had been the target, the outsider, the person singled out for every little so-called violation. Now, suddenly, I was the one holding the gavel. The same homeowners who had once whispered their frustrations in private were looking at me with hope in their eyes, expecting me to fix the mess Carol and her allies had left behind. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a heavy responsibility, and I knew right away that if I didn't act decisively, the board could easily slide back into the same patterns of abuse.
The first order of business
was transparency. On my very first day as president, I called for a full audit of the HOA's finances. No more vague, administrative costs or shadowy reimbursements. Every dollar spent would be accounted for, and every homeowner would have access to those records. The results of that audit confirmed what many of us already suspected. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned off into unnecessary expenses, inflated contracts, and reimbursements for services that clearly benefited Carol and her circle. The discovery infuriated the community, but it also galvanized them. For the first time, homeowners felt empowered to ask questions, to demand answers, and to expect accountability. Instead of a fearful silence, there was open discussion, and slowly, the neighborhood began to breathe again. But if I thought removing Carol from the presidency would make her disappear, I was wrong. She was still a resident, still a homeowner, and she wasn't about to go quietly. She attended every open meeting, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, glaring at me as if daring me to slip up. Whenever I presented new policies, like reducing arbitrary fines or relaxing the ridiculous restrictions on decorations, she raised objections. Sometimes she muttered loudly to other homeowners, sowing doubt. Other times she wrote angry letters, accusing me of destroying the integrity of the community. I quickly realized that winning the presidency was only half the battle. The other half was dismantling the culture of fear she had built. To do that, I focused on small but meaningful changes. We scrapped the rule that dictated the exact height of grass, allowing homeowners more flexibility. We lifted the ban on simple decorations like wreaths, flags, and garden lights. We implemented a fair appeals process so that no one could be fined without the chance to contest it before the entire board. These changes may have seemed minor on paper, but to the residents, they represented freedom. For once, they felt like they actually owned their homes, instead of living under a petty dictatorship. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear of being reported began socializing again. Kids played in the yards without parents, nervously glancing around for clipboard-wielding enforcers. Community events, which had been non-existent under Carol's reign, started happening again: cookouts, yard sales, and block parties that brought people together instead of dividing them. Still, Carol wasn't finished. One evening, I received a notice from the county office. A formal complaint had been filed against me, accusing me of financial mismanagement and abuse of power. According to the complaint, I had been using HOA funds for personal gain. It was a blatant lie, but it was also serious. If the county believed it, I could be removed from office, or worse. It didn't take long to trace the complaint back to Carol. She had tried to weaponize the very same tactics I had used to expose her, but this time the facts were on my side. I submitted the audit records, the public financial reports, and the receipts that showed every penny spent had gone to legitimate community projects. The investigation was closed almost immediately, and Carol was given a warning about filing false reports. That moment was a turning point. It showed the community that not only was I willing to be held accountable, but also that Carol's attempts to cling to power were nothing more than desperate smears. Even her few remaining loyalists began to distance themselves. She went from the queen of the neighborhood to a pariah, someone people avoided at the mailbox or crossed the street to escape. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, she had used shame and intimidation to isolate others. Now, she was the one isolated, trapped by the very culture she had created. As the months passed, Willow Creek transformed into the community it had always pretended to be. Property values stabilized, not because of oppressive enforcement, but because people actually wanted to live here again. New families moved in, drawn by word of mouth, that this was a neighborhood with a fair and transparent HOA. For the first time since I had moved in, I felt proud to call it home. And yet, through it all, I never forgot what had happened. The late-night violation notices, the bogus fines, the foreclosure threat, the humiliation of being singled out. Those experiences hardened me, but they also taught me a lesson. Power without accountability breeds corruption. So, I put safeguards in place, term limits for board members, mandatory audits every year, a requirement that any rule changes be approved by a majority of homeowners, not just the board. These weren't flashy reforms, but they ensured that no future president, myself included, could ever abuse the system the way Carol had. The community flourished under these changes, but for me the most satisfying moment came nearly a year after I became president. It was a quiet afternoon when I stepped outside and saw kids selling lemonade at the corner of the street. Their stand was decorated with bright posters, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Parents stood nearby chatting, neighbors stopped by to buy drinks, and for the first time in years, the air felt light. No one was worried about getting a violation notice. No one was looking over their shoulder. That's when it hit me. The battle had been worth it. Carol had tried to kick me out. She had thrown everything she could at me. Fines, threats, intimidation, and even legal complaints. But instead of breaking me, she had forged me into something stronger. I hadn't just saved my home, I had saved the community. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all.